I took the night shift because the money was honest and because the hours let me keep two jobs without telling anyone I was sleeping through half my life. Golden Triangle Pawn sat with one tire on the shoulder of Highway 82 and the other on a strip of land that used to be cotton and now grew kudzu so thick tractors refused to try. The town of Columbus spread east and west like a set of clean, choked lungs. The pawn shop was a low, square thing with a green awning, a flickering porch light, and a door that never locked when the day workers were inside. At night, it became a place of small objects and big silences, brass, glass, the faint chemical tang of old leather. And those silences were exactly why Mr. Dalton had preferred to work the graveyard for as long as anyone remembered. Before I tell you the rest, stay with this. If you want the whole story, the documents, the ledger, the names that wouldn't stop appearing on my skin, watch until the end. Like and subscribe if this matters to you, and turn on notifications so you don't miss when the memorial goes up. I'm going to tell everything the way it happened. Dalton's rules were the first thing I found after I cleared the back room. They were written in a small spiral notebook, tucked into a pair of gloves folded as if in prayer. The gloves were cracked leather and smelled faintly of something like mothballs and pennies. Dalton's handwriting was neat and patient. The ink bled a little at the edges with age, like a palm print. He had numbered 6 rules and then underlined the page as though that would keep them in place. I read them aloud because reading aloud makes rules real. 1. Quarantine antebellum items in the back room each night. Do not move them after dusk. 2. Never wind the silver music box after dark. Wind only at noon in the light. 3. If the glass fogs, wipe with vinegar and cloth. Names may appear. Do not trace or touch. 4. Break room singing is required before closing on Wednesdays. Sing slowly and keep voices soft. 5. Keep the wooden box with the ledger locked. The 23 objects are not to be separated. 6. Lights out at 3:17 a.m. Sit in the dark 3 minutes to listen, then switch all lights on at once. There was a small, almost apologetic note beneath the rules. If you find the dancer, be kind. If you wind her for them, not for you. Dalton's pen had slept in the line as if he knew the words required more time than he had. I should have quit then. I didn't. I needed the money to cover bills that never stopped arriving, a radiator that leaked, a landlord who never fixed the sagging step, a student loan whose letters still came with that carved arithmetic of threats. It felt ridiculous to tell the truth that poverty made superstition plausible, but the truth was this. I had a life that ran on small, ordinary payments. Night shifts paid a little better. Dalton's rules were a curiosity. I put the notebook back in the gloves and locked the box because locks are a kind of prayer for people like me. The music box came from a woman who smelled of house perfume and tired roses. She dropped it into the deposit tray with a shrug and left the rest of her life in the careful tilt of 2 coins. The silver was nearly dull with handling. The tiny dancer inside a china thing with a hairline crack along one thigh. When daylight hit the metal, it looked like nothing. A trinket, sentimental and light. The woman had warned me without meaning to, just the way people tell you things that belong not to them, but to the air. Don't wind it at night, she said. And when I asked why, she only looked over her shoulder and said, some things ought to sleep. I took it home that first week because I liked the way it closed tight against the palm, the way its hinge clicked with a sound like a small throat clearing. I did not wind it. I put it on the counter and stacked cigarette tins and a jar of keys around it so it seemed mundane. I learned the back room by cataloging. Instruments, a pistol whose serial had been filed away, a mirror with a chip on the lower right, a child's shoe stuffed with pennies, a wooden box that looked ordinary until I pulled out the dust and found a narrow ledger inside. The ledger was smaller than a Bible and thicker with use. Its pages had the brittle scent of old rope and cedar. Names were written in a script that belonged to time before electricity lightened handwriting. On the first page, a date underlined 3 times, August 15, 1853. The ledger contained 23 entries. Each entry had a name, an age, an occupation when it was given, and a price that made the skin on my fingers prickle. The wooden box beneath the ledger held 23 objects, each small and anonymous: a comb, a small iron ring, a fragment of cloth, a child's rattle. The way the objects were arranged felt deliberate, like a prayer bead count left by someone who had to remember. I did not know what the objects meant. I only knew they fit the ledger like a glove fits a hand. The first night something happened, I thought it was the air conditioning. It was close to midnight, and the shop felt like the hollow of a palm, warm, insulated, full of things that had been left for someone else to find. I had wrapped the gloves Dalton had kept around my hands as a joke, rubbing the cracked leather between my thumbs as if it gave me authority over the place. The music box sat under the glass case, small and unassuming. I heard a sound like a hiccup or someone taking a breath. The little dancer's arms twitched as if in wind. I thought the hinge had sprung or that mice had found their way in. The sound the music box made was not music at all. It was a thread pulled backward. The tune was familiar, but the notes were reversed, like a language being unlearned. There was a smell I could not place, thin, metallic, the kind of sweat that clings to collars after long work. The display case glass fogged from the inside, a film rising from the cold pane as if someone had breath on the other side. Words appeared in the condensation, not traced by a hand, but grown, letters that formed as if the moisture read the ledger and decided to make the names visible. Eliza, the glass whispered, then another name, then more. The letters were small and then became large, racing across the glass until my chest felt like a drum caught in a closed room. My hands, the ones in Dalton's gloves, felt hot and then cold. When I touched the glass to clear it, the vinegar bottle Dalton had recommended was on the shelf as if the rule had been placed for me to find. I wiped as the rule said, but I did not touch the letters directly. They did not smudge under the cloth. Instead, they lifted like condensation and left faint, raised maps on my skin. The next morning, I woke to a seam of raised script across my wrist. It was barely red, like a burn that had happened in sleep. The letters formed a name I recognized from the ledger: Thomas Washington. The skin was tender, and the letters stood like tiny ridges when I tilted my hand toward the light. I should have taken the day off to see a doctor. Instead, I sat under the fluorescence and read the ledger until the ink blurred. When the name appeared, it felt intrusive and intimate all at once, as if the past had reached through paper to touch me and ask, "Will you remember me?" I felt guilty for not knowing enough, bitter for not having protested earlier, ashamed that my hands, the hands that priced goods and wrapped purchases in newsprint, had become a surface for history to mark. I had a face for the burden now. Names had weight when they lived on your skin. I brought the ledger and the wooden box to Dr. Nain Broussard because one person in a town like Columbus who read more than the paper and loved history enough to make it his work was a lifeline. Nain was blunt in the way that often felt like kindness. He removed the ledger from my hands with the tenderness of someone who knew how to handle old bones. "This belongs in an archive," he said, flipping pages with gloved fingers. "But it also belongs in a town, not a basement. These entries, look." He had an index of his own, one of those habits learned from years in libraries. Cross-reference the ledger with property records, check deed transfers, examine bill of sale forms. We started in the courthouse, where the clerk wore bifocals and a patience learned from generations of people who needed more than she had to give. Deeds were stubborn in their modesty. Properties changed hands, mortgages read like whispers, and sometimes names were treated like footnotes. On the courthouse microfilm, we found a mention of a sale recorded near Highway 82, a note that read like a ledger's echo. Sale executed, terms as agreed, effective August 15, 1853. The paper's syntax was dry, but the names were there in the spaces between the lines. We found more. A county tax ledger referenced a boarding house for transient labor near the road. A map from 1870 showed a square that matched the pawnshop's lot as an outbuilding then labeled quarters. The shorthand of bureaucracy created a skeleton I could not ignore. Names in the ledger matched entries in estate inventories, and a few survive in scattered newspaper notices where family members were mentioned by first name in lists of people attending a wedding or in the passing of a matron. These were not ghosts of statistics. They became people who once ordered certain kinds of work, or had a favorite dish, or were remembered as good with children. We called descendants carefully, with consent and respect. I remember my hands trembling the first time I dialed a number I found in an obituary index. Joyce Williams answered softly, as if she had been expecting the call and not. "Who is this?" she asked, and I told her the truth, that a ledger listed someone with the same last name as hers, that the ledger belongs to a pawn shop near Highway 82. Joyce listened without interruption and then took a breath. My grandmother used to say there were names no one would say in public, names you kept in your pocket, she told me. If you have a name, you have an obligation. Her voice had something like iron under it. She came to the pawn shop with Robert Freeman a week later. Robert's jaw moved like a hinge through which grief sang. He traced the edges of the wooden box and bowed his head at the sight of the objects. The comb, the child's rattle with a chip of paint missing, the small iron ring. We worked slowly. The town's historical committee was a cave of folded opinions and old friendships. Walter Simmons, their chair, shaped a resistance that wore the language of civility like armor. "We must be cautious," he told us at the first meeting when Noreen presented the ledger in a binder. "History is complex. A marker requires rigorous substantiation." His tone implied that his caution was a virtue and that we were reckless in bringing raw feeling to the public square. He spoke about funding, about precedent, about the danger of upsetting tourism. The ledger was evidence, but evidence in a town was a political instrument. Records meant validation. The names on my skin meant a visceral, personal claim that no budget line could answer. At the next meeting, a woman from the committee asked whether we had considered the effect on property values. Someone else wondered if memorializing pain would transform the town into a scenery of shame. They used the word narrative as if history itself could be edited for convenience. Meanwhile, the Knights kept visiting me. The music box would sit at noon, harmless, and then a sound would show up as if it had taken the day shift. Sometimes it was a child's humming, a voice lifted that could have been from the radio in the 20s. Sometimes the noises stacked. The auctioneer's clipped cadence folded with a crowd's murmur and the soft sob of someone who had been moved across someone else's threshold. Once, when the glass fogged so badly the store felt like a room within a cloud, the condensation wrote a name so quickly across the pane that I felt like I had been slapped by a wet palm. My hands traced the raised letters as if reading Braille, and the letters burned faintly into my fingertips. I knew I was crossing a line. Dr. Broussard, when I told him, stopped flipping pages and asked me a question I could not deny. "Do you want to be a witness," he said, "or do you want to be silent because silence is easier?" "You tell me," I said. I had no idea which answer would make the nightmare stop. He looked at me as if he had always known I would choose the harder one. Witnesses remember, they make places accountable. This is less about hauntings and more about duty. Dalton's gloves smelled of vinegar on some nights and of cedar on others, as if the shop tried to breathe itself back into an order before the ledger came to light. The gloves sat on a stool like a sleeping animal. I wore them when I handled the ledger and the objects because Dalton's note had felt like a set of instructions left by someone who had not wanted to forget. I told myself that the rules were practical, that wines and wicks and vinegar were banal old remedies against humidity and rot. But ritual and rule are twins. Once you learn a ritual, the world concedes to it some shape. The scars spread. They were not permanent at first, raised pink lines like calluses that became darker at night. Names kept adding themselves. Each time a name appeared, I dug into it, and each name I verified seemed to answer the music box's backward song. Sometimes, music box wound itself for a fraction of an instant, and the dancer turned her head toward me, chin lifted like a person calling attention to something too heavy to say. At the courthouse, a paper clerk helped me unspool the ledger's threads. We found a bill of sale registered to a man whose name we had never heard in daily life, but who belonged to the town's mid-century list of landowners. The bill itself was a form, an arithmetic of cost and transfer. In it, the people listed had been rendered as property in the language of commerce, names followed by numbers. I sat across from the clerk and let the ink sit in my lungs. The clerk tapped the paper like someone reading a label on a medicine bottle. "Hard to stomach," she said. And then she told me about the deed transfers that sometimes came with farms and houses. "If you push, you find records," she told me. We pushed. Dr. Broussard published a short piece with some scanned documents and a cautious argument that these records warranted a local marker. The historical committee convened. Walter Simmons said, "We should be careful not to import present-day anger into 19th century acts." Some people nodded as if nuance was a cloak that absolved moral obligation. Others, like Joyce and Robert, showed up at the meeting and read names aloud with a quiet so steady it made the room stiffer than any argument. The ledger had 23 names. A small gallery of objects tied to those names stood in the wooden box like an accusatory altar. We found a letter tucked into Dalton's notebook, not in his hand but in a different copper-tone script. Dalton had kept a short explanation of the rituals. He spoke there of containment and of mercy, but also of guilt. "I tended them," he had written, "because I could not save them. My job was to keep the names." The guilt softened his instruction into a plea. On a night when the light bulb above the counter hummed like a bee, the music box wound itself. The tune was backward, and the shop filled with the noise of an auction in the most intimate register. Not the spectacle, but the ledgered, numbered reality of commerce. Calls, a hammer's rap somewhere far off, footfalls across rough floorboards, a child's breath held. A voice said, "Sold," and my skin crawled as the word found a place on my arm like a brand. I did not want to close my eyes, because when I closed them, the past filled every space. I started to photograph the ledger and the objects, careful not to expose sensitive details to anyone without consent. I kept a file, images, transcriptions, dates, because paper could be lost, but digital copies could be replicated and shared with the descendants if they wanted. At the same time, I feared that sharing too much would turn grief into spectacle. There was a thin line between honoring and exposing. Joyce pulled me aside one afternoon as we sat on the back step and lit cigarettes, though neither of us smoked much. "Be careful," she said. "We don't need pity. We need acknowledgement. You hear the difference?" "I hear it," I told her. "I want to be careful." "We're not museum exhibits," she said. "If we do this, we do it for us, not for the clicks." Her warning was a tether. It kept me from posting images the way people post curiosities. It reminded me that these names were not story prompts, but relatives. The ledger's names began to fill out with faces and stories. Sarah Jackson, who liked to sing lullabies and whose descendant carried a name like a stone. Thomas Washington, who had been a cooper. Eliza Freeman, who whistled when she worked. I learned these particulars from interviews and from the brittle pages of family Bibles people brought in because family Bibles like to remember things that governments ignore. Institutional resistance hardened. The Preservation Committee postponed votes and asked for more academic validation. Walter Simmons argued that a plaque would invite controversy. A councilman suggested a panel discussion first, a way to digest the academic side. Meanwhile, an undocumented, grainy photograph surfaced in a local collection. A faded image of a wooden platform beside a road, people clustered like shadows. The photograph lacked faces. It had a presence like a memory holding its breath. Nayan put it under a scanner and showed it to the town. People squinted and argued about who might be who. Some familiar citizens did not like being asked to look at their own pasts this closely. The hauntings became less a private terror and more a social instrument, not because they were a weapon, but because they demanded witnesses. Dalton's rules had functioned as containment. When we adhered to them, the episodes seemed more like warnings than storms. The 3:17 a.m. lights out ritual, once an oddity I followed more out of superstition than conviction, began to feel like a listening exercise. On nights I sat in the dark, the shop hummed differently. Voices that had been a mess of sound smoothed into outlines, like someone tracing letters with a finger. Once, sitting with my palms open on my knees, I heard a phrase that stuck like a burr. "Tell our names." That imperative changed everything. It set an aim that wasn't about exorcism, but about language. The spirits, or whatever reached through the glass, were not trying to frighten us into fleeing. They were asking for acknowledgement, for the ritual of being named. Naming is civic work. It ties a life to a place, to deeds, to the ledger that bore their cost. Once I thought of it that way, the marks on my hands felt less like curses and more like ballots, votes cast by history into the present. We planned a public reveal carefully. Nayan drafted a report with references and a recommended path to memorialization. Joyce and Robert gathered descendants to tell family histories. Dalton's notebook and gloves went into a locked exhibit case, while I kept a copy of the ledger on my person at all times. We requested a hearing with the historical committee and prepared to show the documents, the photograph, and the 23 objects. I rehearsed saying names out loud in the meeting room until my mouth formed the syllables like a ritual code. On the morning of the hearing, a heat wave had rolled in off the cotton fields, and the air smelled heavy like the slow sweating of the earth. People filled the meeting hall, descendants, curious neighbors, those who wanted to see what controversy looked like in daylight. Walter Simmons spoke first, courteous and slow, and then Nayan presented the ledger. When he read the first names, the room went quiet, and I could feel the same hush that fell in the pawn shop on nights when the glass fogged. I raised my hand and said, "I will read them." It felt right at that moment to let the names be a chorus. I read the 23 names, and when I reached the last, a woman in the back stood and clapped very softly, the sound of one palm asking applause. The committee deferred judgment. That night, the music box turned itself in the dark and the dancer bowed. I was starting to believe we could move from seeing to doing. When my hand swelled up the next morning with letters that spelled out Sarah Jackson in a line like a bracelet, I understood that the past would not be content to wait. The marks had a way of insisting. They made the ledger less like an object and more like a project. Identification, outreach, consent, and then a public acknowledgement. We had to build a plan that protected people and honored their agency. We would not name descendants on a plaque without permission. We would not show images without context. We would not let the town's desire for a tidy story decide the shape of truth. There was still skepticism. At a second committee meeting, Walter Simmons voiced a worry I had come to know too well, that once memorialization started, the town would be remade into something it was not ready to be. This could open wounds, he said, as if wounds needed permission to be acknowledged. People in the room nodded with a polite, exhausted empathy. "But wounds heal by being cared for," Joyce answered. "Ignoring them is how they fester into something worse." The ledger's names had started to reach beyond me. A local school asked if we could bring the story in as part of a lesson on local history, and a church offered a room for a small exhibit. I refused both at first. The ledger had a gravity I didn't want to trivialize in a lesson plan or a Sunday potluck. But then Joyce sat me down and said, "This is already in school. It is in the way our town forgets, and in the way our young folks grow up thinking some names never existed. If you don't let them know, someone else will twist it." I agreed. We started small, a cataloged exhibit in the community center with the ledger behind glass, explained with context and sensitivity. We held listening sessions for descendants, offering them the chance to decide how their ancestors would be represented. We applied for grants. We wrote letters. We held cold, bureaucratic meetings and warm kitchen table conversations. Each step was a condensation of labor and memory. One night, after a long day of transcription and calls, I sat in the back room with Dalton's notebook and the gloves on the stool beside me. The music box sat open, the dancers still. The shop smelled of vinegar from the wipes we used on the glass, a smell that had come to feel like a disinfectant for the mind when memory stung. I wound the box once, as Dalton had said one could with care during the day, and the dancer spun obediently. The little sound she made was not reversed now. It was forward and hesitant, like a thing learning how to speak again. For a moment, the shop felt full and not frightening. I heard in the faintest register the cadence of a lullaby and the rustle of cotton. My hand brushed the ledger, and the raised letters cooled under my palm. The town had not decided anything yet, but I had. The marks on my hands, the ledger, the objects, and the names had made a single demand that required an answer larger than fear. To remember, to document, to create a place where those 23 names could be seen and their lives acknowledged. We were building towards something that would be public and ritualized and communal, a place that felt like answering a summons rather than exorcising a ghost. If honoring names was an act of civic repair, then we needed a site, a ceremony, and people who would not allow the story to be edited. I could already imagine a plaque, and more than that, an education center where students could learn the measured, unglamorous arithmetic of how lives were priced and how courage resists being erased. That night as I closed, the glass fogged one more time and wrote a single word that I had not seen in the ledger. It was small and very old. I cleaned it with vinegar as Dalton's rule said, and when I looked at my palm, the letters were there, faint and warm. Remember. I did. I began a list. I started by writing the names down on a sheet of paper and then transcribing each ledger entry into a digital file, citing the documents, the deed records, the family notes. I called the people who had agreed to join the project and asked for their stories. I started to schedule interviews that would preserve voice and memory rather than reduce it to data. The work felt like saving stones out of an eroding wall. But the ledger and the music box had not finished with me. The more I recorded, the more the marks arrived. Sometimes they came in the morning as faint lines. Sometimes the names appeared after a vision that left the whole shop smelling like cotton and tears. I could not say whether the marks were punishment or summons. They felt like both, a responsibility that did not ask for consent and a burden I had offered willingly. We prepared for the first public event, a quiet presentation at the community center where we would show the ledger, present genealogical findings, and propose the memorial. I rehearsed the names until my lips could say them without my chest collapsing. Joyce asked for a ritual, simple and respectful. She suggested that Dalton's music box be wound in the daylight, that a bill of sale be read and then burned by a safe, symbolic fire, that names be spoken in turn by descendants and supporters. Burning a bill of sale felt right to me because paper had been the instrument of denial in commerce. Burning it would not erase the ledger, but it would complete a ritual that town needed to enact publicly. People who opposed us circulated rumors about sensationalism. They said this was a reopening of old grievances. Others, who had been quietly waiting for the town to do something honest, lined up to lend financial support. The Preservation Committee held another meeting and offered, with constraints, permission for an informational plaque but not a full marker. We refused the plaque alone. That was the moment the grassroots took over. The church put up a small fund, descendants pledged time, Nayen connected us to archival grants, and Joyce mobilized a group to canvass for signatures. As plans grew, the nights became less solitary. We invited people to the shop to learn to listen at 3:17 a.m., to sit in the dark for 3 minutes as Dalton had instructed, to feel the silence and then flip the light together. A handful of volunteers came, mostly younger, some with cameras and some simply with quiet earnestness. The first time a crowd sat in the pawn shop at 317, the music box did not interrupt us. Instead, after the 3 minutes of listening, we flipped the lights and a single name fogged the glass. It felt collaborative, the town learning to be a witness together. The ledger remained the axis. Each time a new mark appeared on my skin, it sent me back into the archives, into family albums, into attics smelling of sewing needles and old cloth. We found letters from people who had been taken away and kept names alive in marginalia of legal documents. We found an 1871 census with a line scratched out and the name of a child left. These were small proofs, not theatrical revelations, but they did what proof must do. They made denial harder. We were still months away from the public dedication where the music box would be wound in daylight and the bill of sale read and burned, but the direction of things had shifted. The town could no longer pretend the ledger wasn't there. The scars on my hands had become a kind of map. I had learned where they would appear if I ignored certain nights. I had learned to sleep with light and wake with names on my wrists. I had made peace with a rhythm that involved discomfort and obligation. The work changed me into someone less willing to let a name vanish. One Saturday in July, a little girl with a braid and a quick laugh came into the pawn shop with her grandmother. She carried a small scrap of cloth and eyes that asked more questions than she could speak. When she saw the wooden box, she reached in and touched the rattle with the chip of paint. "Is this mine?" she asked, as if her question could be answered by objects alone. Her name was Maya, and she was a descendant of Sarah Jackson. She had brought a song her grandmother used to sing. The song was thin and high, and it fit in the shop like light. For the first time in a long while, the music box stayed still while a living voice filled the space. We had built, in a disordered way, the beginnings of something that could keep memory fresh without ownership. The ledger was not a curiosity in a window anymore. It was a collection of lives that a town could either make room for or try to bury. The work would be hard and contested and messy. It would involve committees, grants, and gracious refusals. It would require listening and not assuming that my marks were the town's proof. I kept a record of every name that appeared on my skin and cross-checked it with documents. The ledger's 23 entries took on an urgency I had not expected. The music box had brought them to me one by one, and I had become, perhaps unwillingly at first, their custodian. The question was not only how to remember them, but how to turn that remembering into a civic structure that would not dissolve when the immediate attention faded. When the committee delayed the vote, Joyce organized a petition drive. When the press sniffed around, Nyan kept them focused on documents and avoided sensational language. Walter Simmons later surprised many of us by showing up at one of the listening sessions and not leaving. He had lines on his face that looked like someone who slept fitfully the way people do when reputations shift. He asked to look at the ledger himself and then asked quietly whether the town might do more than a plaque. By autumn, we had collected oral histories, transcribed pages, and secured a room in the old cotton warehouse for a small exhibit and an eventual memorial. People who had opposed the project began to come by with donations, not because they had changed their minds entirely, but because the ledger had made the past undeniable in a way that required action. The dance of resistance and reconciliation is always uneven, and in Columbus it took the form of letters, petitions, and finally signatures. Yet no one expected what happened at the auction vision. That night the music box wound itself. The dancer turned. The shop filled with the crowd's low mutter that sharpened into the thin, precise chorus of an auction in 1853. The temperature dropped. The smell of earth and cotton and old tobacco pressed against the glass like a hand. The vision was not cinematic in the way movies stage things. It was close, intimate, and it entrusted me with an image that I could not simply tell without being shaken. A line of 23 faces turned away and then toward a platform. Names called and exchanged as property. The ledger's handwriting seemed to ink itself into the air. I felt each name settle into my blood the way you feel cold when water passes a threshold. The marks spread like a map. This was the moment the work demanded of me more than paperwork. To take the ledger, the wooden box, the music box, and the voices that had claimed me, and put them into a ceremony that would be public and careful. It was the point where haunting turned into civic demand, where memories would be made visible, where names would be spoken in a town hall, where a bill of sale would be read and burned. We would need descendants to be brave. The committee would need to stop being busy with its own fears. The town would need to show up. I kept the list on my desk, the ledger under glass, the music box wound only by day, Dalton's rules adhered to as if they were liturgy. I had scarred hands and a ledger to prove it, and the town had a ledger that refused to be silent. The memory had come to reside in me and in the objects, and whether the community embraced them or balked, the work of memorialization had begun. In the weeks that followed, we planned the dedication. We rehearsed reading names aloud, we secured permits for a symbolic burning, and we gathered descendants to speak. I became, unwillingly, an organizer and a witness, and I found that the two roles demanded of me the same thing: fidelity to the facts and tenderness for the people who remained. On the morning of the dedication, I woke to a line of names along my forearm written as neatly as a clerk's hand. They looked like ink and like scars, as if history had signed me for the duty. I dressed in a shirt that I hoped looked like seriousness and not performance. Outside, the cotton field shivered in the wind like a congregation. We gathered at the edge of Highway 82 where the old road bent and the pawn shop's lot opened to a wider horizon. Descendants came with photographs and songs and stories. The wooden box was carried with clean hands and slow steps. We had an interpreter for the ledger, someone who could read the old terms and make them plain. We had Dalton's gloves laid in a place of honor near the exhibit. The music box would be wound in daylight, and then the bill of sale would be read and burned in a small brazier under careful watch. As the crowd formed and the cameras and the people found their places, the music box opened and the dancer turned. I wound her by hand as Dalton had instructed, and her tune filled the air forward and not backward. A hush came over the group. The ledger lay open on a table with the 23 names visible, as if they had always been waiting for this moment to become public. When I began to read, my voice trembled. Names are slippery things when you say them aloud. Pronunciation matters, the cadence matters, the way a family says an ancestor's name with comfort or anger. Joyce and Robert spoke in turn, and then descendants I had met in living rooms and kitchens read their lines with a steadiness that was both private and communal. When Nayan took the ledger to the brazier and read the bill of sale, he used the language of the document, and with each line we burned a small strip of the paper. The fire did not erase the ledger. It symbolized that commerce and law had once given license to treating people as property, and that we, in the present, would not let that stand unchallenged. As ash rose in the air and the names were spoken into the wind, something changed in the way the music box sounded. The dancer slowed and then rested. The marks on my hands cooled like a fever breaking. People wept in a way that was not spectacle but release, and the town, for a moment, folded into something like a single breath. The day was not a finishing. There was no final absolution snapped shut like a lid. The memorial would require maintenance, funding, education, and continual witness. Yet when I saw the ledger locked into a case at the heart of the new center, and watched descendants lay photographs and letters beside it, I felt a kind of peace descend that had rate and shape. The music box set nearby, wound now for the final ceremony, and the dancer turned for a brief, bright moment, as if nodding to us that the work of remembering could indeed move a town. I became curator because no one else's life fit that role better than mine now. The marks had made me a steward. The center opened slowly, funded by grants and the small donations of townspeople who had grown tired of pretending the past did not reach across their sidewalks. The ledger remained under glass, but copies circulated. The names were printed in booklets and taught in high school classes that asked students to research and respect, not sensationalize. Sometimes, at night, if I leave the back window unlocked and listen, there is a child's voice humming a tune that sounds like the dancer's music box. Once, a little girl visiting the center started to sing softly in the corner, the same slow lullaby her grandmother had brought. It echoed in the rooms and made the lights feel kinder. The marks on my skin softened and in time were mostly faint, but they never disappeared entirely. A name would surface now and then, a reminder that memory is a living thing that requires tending. The memorial is not a monument to finality, it is a beginning. We still find names in attics and in county records. Dr. Broussard and I continue to trace lines. Joyce and Robert and their families help lead programs. Walter Simmons, who once resisted, now volunteers on a committee that teaches students about the ledger's context. People who were once wary have become steady partners. The town is not absolved, but it listens in ways it did not before. And sometimes, when the night is still and the music box rests on its shelf, the shop smells faintly of vinegar and cotton and a child's breath held by a tucked-away corner of history. I put Dalton's gloves in a drawer and place the dancer nearby. I wind her in daylight, carefully, for the memory of the 23 who were named and the work that still calls us to remember them, not as a spectacle, not as a story to be told for entertainment, but as a civic act that honors persons who were once numbered and returns to them the dignity of being spoken. We still get letters from people who find their own family names in the ledger. We bring them in, we ask permission, we learn. The marks on my hand serve as a small reminder that I answered when history asked me to be a witness. I tell the story now because someone asked me to tell the truth plainly, and because the town continues to need people who will read a ledger and hear names as human. There will always be work to do, more documents to locate, more descendants to listen to, more careful decisions to make about how memory is taught and preserved. Sometimes, late at night, when the center is dark and the stars over Highway 82 hang like pins in fabric, I hear a child hum and a glass fogs with a single name. I wipe it with vinegar and a cloth, as Dalton taught me, and I do not trace the letters. I leave them. I document them. I call someone to bring tea and conversation and the tools we use to make memory into something we can touch without flattening. The dance between past and present continues, but there is less terror now and more tending. There is one last thing I keep with me, the small, careful list of 23 names I have written by hand. It sits in a notebook beside other records. I add to it when a new piece of evidence turns up, and I cross-reference it with deeds and oral histories. When people ask why I did not walk away, I say the obvious and the true. Because someone has to say the names aloud. Because saying them is a kind of repair. Because the marks on my hands reminded me how easy it is to live with history asleep and how necessary it is to wake it with dignity. We are not finished. The Education Center will need teachers and papers and a program that insists on care over curiosity. There will be more nights when glass fogs and names peel into the air. There will be more hearings and more negotiations. But the ledger is in a place of honor now, and when the music box turns, it does so forward and not backward. The dancer bows and the town leans in to listen. I learned through all of this that memory asks for witnesses, and that witnesses sometimes come with scars. If you heard any of this and it moved you, consider supporting local history work where you live. Look into archives and listen for names that history has tried to scrub. We cannot fix everything, but we can make a place where people are spoken of as people again. When the music box plays at the dedication every year, a child will wind it and the dancer will turn, and we will read the names aloud into the wind that travels across Highway 82 and the cotton fields. For now, we keep working. Piece by piece, name by name, and we sit with the ledger like a living thing that asks to be respected. On the morning of the first dedication, the air along Highway 82 held that peculiar hush that comes before heat. The cotton fields leaned low, and the town gathered in small, careful clusters. Joyce arranged chairs. Robert checked the sound of the speaker's small amplifier twice and then set it aside, embarrassed by its clumsiness. Dr. Broussard stood near the ledger with his hands folded, like someone about to hold a fragile animal. Walter arrived early and met my eyes with a look that was neither apology nor absolution, but a kind of mutual recognition. We had both been moved to do what had to be done. A child, chosen because she had wound the box at the first public rehearsal and because she practiced gentleness, came forward with small, certain steps. I watched her fingers circle the brass key. When the dancer turned, the music did not belong to any one of us. It belonged to the town and to those whose names were written there. I opened my notebook and read, slowly, each of the 23 names, letting the syllables find their place in the air. Faces softened. Some mouths formed prayers. Others did not know what to do with grief and simply listened. Afterward, people lingered around the ledger. A woman traced the scar at my wrist with her thumb in a gesture halfway between gratitude and grief. Walter stayed until the last chair was stacked and told me quietly that he had taught a class that month about why records matter. We did not pretend the ledger repaired everything. There were absences that would never be filled. But as the music box's song dwindled and the child blew out the candle by habit rather than ceremony, I felt something like steadiness settle over us. I closed the ledger carefully and walked it to its new case. Dalton's gloves sat in my drawer, folded as if for a task not yet finished. I left them there. We had wound the music box together, and now the town would keep winding it, name by name, year by year. Saying the names was repair enough for one small town. It was also a promise. We would keep listening. We would keep naming. We would keep tending the places where memory could breathe.